want to talk about the launch of a new book called Ernest Gellner's Legacy and Social Theory Today. Ernest Gellner was my head of department and close friend, and there is a launch conference going on to which I'm contributing, and this is what I would like to say about Ernest in relation to the question of where does he meet our needs today and where does he not so much meet our needs. So in terms of meeting our needs, I think his approach is the right one. His approach is the Enlightenment approach. He's the last in many ways of the great Enlightenment period of his hero David Hume and others like Adam Smith, Montesquieu, and later Enlightenment-wide thinkers like Max Weber. And so he asks the big questions. What is the modern world? How did it get here? What can we do about its defects? What are its advantages? And those are the questions we should continue to ask. They haven't gone away, although many people narrow down to sub-questions within it. So the approach in that way is right. Secondly, the approach, being so large, requires more than one discipline. You can't label Ernest. He is obviously trained in philosophy and knows some philosophy. He was a professor of philosophy. He was a professor of sociology. He was a professor of anthropology. And he spent quite a bit of time towards the end writing about history. So he brings in all the social sciences, not so much psychology, though he did want to be trained in that too. So he's got the tools, he's got the question, and he's got the background to a certain extent of experience. He has done field work not just in one place. His PhD in North Africa among the Berbers was one, but he knows about North Africa, he knows about the Middle East and Islam, he knows about Eastern Europe, coming from Czechoslovakia and also working on the Soviet Union, and he knows a good deal about continental and Western Europe, including England. So he's got a broad span of most of Western Europe and going into Islam. And finally, he has an inquisitive and even combative approach. He doesn't accept anything as given. It's the Cartesian, Humean approach of distrusting orthodoxies of any kind. And his work is characterized by an undermining or questioning of many what he would consider to be closed cult-like activities, like postmodernism, like psychoanalysts, like Oxford linguistic philosophers, like the Soviet system even, and like Islam. So these four features make him a person who is still absolutely relevant. And also we can draw from some of his major conclusions and contributions. In nationalism, his work on nationalism, though limited, is still very relevant, particularly in showing that nationalism is deeply related to the social, economic, technological background from which it emerged, and his work is very influential and helpful in relation to certain branches of nationalism. In terms of history, his idea of the great shifts particularly from agrarian civilizations to industrial ones, is still the question we should be looking at, and he provides many insights into the mysteries of that change. His work on concepts and society I found deeply helpful. The idea that we don't just see the world head on, that we live within a bubble or a surrounding set of filters which filter reality, and therefore what we see is deeply shaped by underlying assumptions and cosmologies of which we are not aware. and that is exactly how it is. And finally, in relation to liberty, his work on the conditions of liberty, I think, is brilliant, and he is deeply aware of the importance, the uniqueness, and the peculiarity of living within a world of liberty, the world he rejoiced in the Scottish Enlightenment. So Ernest has the basic preconditions for great work, which is a sense, as Adam Smith put it, of wonder and surprise, and therefore he came to new things and gave us a fresh view of almost everything he touched on. In terms of his limitations, he was educated and brought up, and his experience was Western European, and he never really engaged with the 3/4 of the world which is outside Europe and the west of the Soviet Union and Islam. This is perfectly understandable. That's the way I was brought up, and that's how most Western thinkers still remain. He's no different from most Western thinkers. And although he did visit Nepal and Japan and no doubt Africa and elsewhere, he really never engaged. So the world has changed, particularly since his sad early death. The world has changed, and we now live in a different world. We live in a global world where we have to try and understand not just Western civilization, but the rest, and not just small tribal societies in Africa or the Pacific, but great civilizations like Japan or China or India or elsewhere. And for that, his background was not appropriate. He often reminds me of stories of Einstein, who had brilliantly outlined the basic laws of physics in the tradition of the Greek and Western scientific tradition, based on binary thinking and fundamental belief in the stability of the universe. And then when he was faced with quantum thought, he just found it repellent. God does not play dice, etc., because it basically questioned whether there was finally a stable universe out there. And though he gradually accommodated himself to it, he found it repellent and undermining. And that's how, in discussions with Ernest and watching his reactions to things, I think Ernest felt about thought coming from the great civilizations, particularly of China and Japan, where you don't have a single God, you don't have a single origin, and things are muddled and messy. There are endless contradictions, statements which are both true and false at the same time, much too much relativism, which he was opposed to. And so he rejected that. He had to keep his world tightly bound together in order to make sense of it. And therefore, in a way, what we now have to do is to do to Ernest what he did to all these enclosed thought systems, and that is to interrogate him, to see that his system is also closed in certain ways, and it needs some opening out and fresh air brought into it, not to destroy it, but to use his wisdom and wide and penetrating and often amusing thoughts to illuminate a world which is now filled with contradictions and global pressures and currents which he was not in a position really to understand.